Today marks the beginning of a new month of services connecting with the theme of spiritual practices, though in a way I started a week early with my sermon on hospitality last Sunday. And of course, at the end of that sermon on hospitality, I invited you to be part of Bring a Friend to Church Day, which is today. In fact, I had worked out with Joanne, our Director of Religious Education, that today would be Bring a Friend to Church Day long before Chris, our student minister, had suggested that this month's theme be spiritual practices. So when I decided that my sermon this morning would be about our 7 principles as a good way to introduce new people to Unitarian Universalism, that decision pretty quickly led to the question, where does the spiritual practice part come into it? In her sermon 2 weeks ago, UUFP member Rosalie Pfister told you about a group game that we played at the retreat this year. Teams of players had to race from one location to another around the campsite, completing tasks at a number of different stations, and then returning to the starting point with proof that they'd completed them all. One of the tasks, for instance, took place in the kitchen of the main lodge, where players had to prepare 2 loaves of garlic bread. The game took place not long before dinner, so why not help get the meal ready while also having a little fun? Another task wasn't quite so easy to complete. At the station I was overseeing, the players had to work together as a team to recite the 7 principles. They could say them in any order, and I was willing to accept the naming of keywords rather than the complete word-for-word language, but I'm not sure that that made it a whole lot easier. I am sure that each team spent longer at my station than at any other. The fact is that the principles are not poetry. They don't tell a story. They are hard to remember. Even the various children's version of the 7 principles, including one that relates each principle to one of the colours of the rainbow, aren't much easier. So this is where it occurred to me that the spiritual practice piece of this might come in. I was amazed to hear some years ago that there are people who have memorized the whole of the Quran. At more than 77,000 words, that's quite a feat. Once someone has proved that they do indeed know the entire text, such as by continuing the recitation of any randomly selected passage, then they earn the title of Hafiz or Hafiza, meaning guardian, and they are highly respected by other Muslims. Devotees of other faiths may similarly memorize their holy texts too. And while I don't know of any Unitarian Universalists who would consider our 7 principles to be scripture as such, there's still something to be said for the dedication and commitment that it would take to intentionally memorize them, from being good mental exercise, like weightlifting for the brain, to providing a deeper way to reflect on what our faith means. And at a mere 81 words, the principles are much shorter than the Quran. So my goal this morning is for us to do some groundwork that I hope will help you to remember our 7 principles. Don't worry, there will not be a test. And if you actually want to be able to recite them, well, you'll need to work on that some more in your own time. You have the principles and sources bookmarks that you received with your orders of service to help you, of course. But I assure you that as with any spiritual practice, you will get a whole lot more out of it than the immediate fruit of your labor. Let me begin by talking about what the 7 principles actually are. When Unitarian Universalists think about the values that define our faith, and particularly when we try to explain this religion to non-UUs, we often turn to our 7 principles. We like to say that there's little in them that most reasonable people, whether they're UUs or not, would reject. But we do hold them up as defining in particular what it means to be a UU. In fact, though, the principles are part of a covenant that Unitarian Universalist congregations make with each other, part of the promise that UU congregations and communities make as members of a larger association. Just as printed on your bookmarks, the principles are actually part of a longer passage that begins with these words: "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote." So these are actually values that UU congregations promise to uphold as part of being in relationship with one another through the UUA. Following the listing of our 7 principles is a listing of our 6 sources, which continues onto the back of your bookmark. And then the passage concludes with these words: "As free congregations, we enter into this covenant, promising to one another our mutual trust and support." Again, this is about the promises that UU congregations make to one another and to the wider world as part of being in this voluntary association. Now, this passage, by the way, is a direct quote from Article 2 of the bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Giving an indication of its importance, the only thing that comes before it in the bylaws, namely Article 1, is the specification of the UUA's name. And then, reinforcing the claim that the principles are part of what it means to be a UU congregation, another part of Article 2 is about individual freedom of belief, the so-called Liberty Clause. With roots going back to a Universalist profession of faith issued in 1803, this clause guarantees that nobody will be required to believe certain things in order to join a UU congregation. It's not even necessary to believe in the 7 principles, to whatever extent it makes sense to say that anyone can believe in them. So while it is necessary to be of goodwill and in sympathy with the mission and vision of this fellowship to become a member of this congregation, there is no requirement. There can never be a requirement that any member hold any particular set of beliefs. Of course, the same values named in our 7 principles can be affirmed and promoted by individuals as well. I really do believe that there's little in them that most reasonable people would simply reject. Who wouldn't be on board, at least in such broad terms, with ideas like justice and compassion and the right of conscience? So in many Unitarian Universalist congregations, the language of the 7 principles has been adapted into what is sometimes called the 7 promises, a covenant that individual UUs would make with each other. And as you now know from our responsive reading this morning, this fellowship made its own version of the 7 promises some years ago as well. Now, in some ways, the 7 promises actually have some advantages over the 7 principles. There's a benefit anyway in taking language that describes the promises that UU congregations make to one another and to the wider world as members of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and turning that into promises that UU individuals make to one another and to the wider world as members of a congregation. But there are advantages too. For one thing, the 7 principles lack verbs. Chris commented on this back in September when she was talking about interdependence, the great theological insight of the 7th principle. It declares the fact of the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, but how do we actually do interdependence? As Chris said, most of us would feel pretty foolish trying to use the word interdepend as a verb. But as individuals, we can promise to live lightly on the earth. For another, the first principle seems really hard to put into practice. How do we really believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person when that's supposed to apply not only to people we do respect, but also to, say, a sheriff's deputy who slams a high school student to the ground and then drags her across the floor? It certainly seems more doable to turn it into an individual promise that we make to listen actively and speak and act respectfully to others. But even if the 7 promises have these advantages, they can still provide a helpful reframing of the 7 principles, even helping to make the principles more memorable too. I bet you are all a little more familiar with the 1st and 7th principles now. Of course, in the group game we played at the retreat, most people found it pretty easy to come up with those too. If you would look at your bookmarks, let's read aloud now together the 1st and the 7th principles. The inherent worth and dignity of every person, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Unitarian Universalist minister Barbara Wells describes these 2 principles as pillars that support the others between them. If you imagine an archway made out of 7 large stones, then the middle 5 principles provide the 5 stones of the arch itself, while the 1st and the 7th principles are the pillars that hold up that arch. Wells explains that in her view, these 2 principles, the one about every person, the other about all existence, are the closest Unitarian Universalism comes to a true and absolute faith statement. As she puts it, they are statements of what we affirm about life. They are the pillars that hold up the other 5 principles, which are more about how we agree to be together. And Wells points out that both of them are really about love, a radical love that knows no boundaries. And love, of course, is a verb. I'll come back to the archway image, but in my experience, the 1st and 7th principles are also gateways, in that they provide 2 common points of entry into our faith. Many people come to Unitarian Universalism because they're thinking about or working out issues relating to either how people treat one another or how people treat the world we share. And of course, that's not an exclusive or, because concerns about how we treat one another and how we treat the world in which we live really do go hand in hand. I know I was motivated to seek out the UU congregation in large part because of what I was learning about environmentalism. But I quickly realized that I couldn't separate that from matters of social justice, given that it's not just the interdependent web of all existence, but the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. After the 1st and 7th principles, the next one that I think all of the teams playing the group game at the retreat could remember was the 4th principle. If you would look at your bookmarks again, let's read aloud together the 4th principle. A free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Returning to the image of an archway made up of 7 large stones, then at the top of the arch, in the middle, the key stone holding all of the other stones in place is the 4th principle. Now, if the 7th and particularly the 1st principles are universalist, then the 4th is definitely Unitarian. What's worth thinking about for this principle is that it talks about not merely a free search for truth and meaning, but a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. There's a lot more to this than what might otherwise be idle curiosity, because there are always consequences. Applied to individuals, just because we know something, should we act upon it? If I know that something that somebody says is wrong, does it matter? Is correcting them worth the possible hurt to their feelings? Applied to society, just because we know how to do something, does that mean that we should? We know that there's a huge amount of coal still in the ground, but should we really dig it up and burn it for cheap energy? Or should we leave it in the ground and find ways to get carbon dioxide and other pollution out of the atmosphere instead? Knowledge always has consequences, so the responsibility side of our search for truth and meaning is essential. So that's the 1st, 4th and 7th principles. Those are relatively easy to remember. And in the group game at the retreat, the remaining principles were much harder for the teams to articulate. But just as I gave them clues to help them come up with them, there are some things that can help make it easier to remember them. There's a symmetry, for instance. Let's take a look at the second and sixth principles to see how that works. If you would look at your bookmarks again, let's read aloud the second and then the sixth principles. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Notice how the word justice is in both of them. It's actually the only key word in all the principles to appear twice. So these two principles are both about how we want people to be treated fairly. The second in terms of direct relationships between individuals, and the sixth in terms of how society treats people. What's more, they relate to the neighbouring outer principles too. The second talks about what it means to put into practice the radical love for other people, manifesting in the 7 promises as a form of the golden rule, to treat others as we ourselves would like to be treated. While the sixth talks about what it means to put into practice the radical love for the interdependent web of all existence, a portion of which is human society. In some places, by the way, you might even hear the sixth principle referred to as the Superman principle, given that talking about peace, liberty, and justice for all simply seems to evoke an image of the superhero in many people's minds. And that brings us to the last two to remember. If you would look at your bookmarks one more time, let's read aloud together the third and the fifth principles. Acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. These two also have a symmetry between them. The third, like the second, is about how we relate to one another, but with an added emphasis on how we don't just stay the same forever, but change and hopefully grow as individuals. And that's something that takes the support and encouragement of others. And the fifth, like the sixth, is how we should relate to the larger groups of which we are a part, particularly in terms of how decisions are made collectively, so that human society can grow into that world community of peace and justice. As I wrote in my column that appeared in today's daily press, the right to participate in shared decision-making is inseparable from shared responsibility for the health of the community, whether that community is one congregation or a whole country. Finally, there's one more way of thinking about our 7 principles that can help you remember them all. There is, as I've already implied, an overall progression of scale as one principle follows another. In the usual order, as they appear on your bookmarks, the principles start with the individual, then move up through the relational, the congregational, and the social, to finish with the cosmic. Of course, in other words, the vision that the principles offer gets progressively larger. But of course, it also works the other way around as well. In the responsive reading I adapted from the 7 promises, for instance, I reverse the usual order and start with the interdependent web, because for me that's what holds everything else together, starting with the cosmic and moving deeper to finish with the individual. However you choose to set about doing it, I encourage you to spend a little more time thinking about our 7 principles. Take your bookmark with you. This is yours to take with you today. Keep it in a handy place, maybe actually use it as a bookmark in a book you're reading, and look it over as the opportunity presents itself. See if you can commit the principles to memory. I promise you that you'll feel quite a sense of accomplishment if you succeed, not to mention engaging in some weightlifting for your brain. It'll also provide you with some ways to think about the claims that our faith makes, to reflect on what it really means to announce these values and aspirations to the world. For just as we are called, in Henry David Thoreau's words, to live deliberately, so is faith made all the better by engaging with it, to know it by experience, and to be able to give a true account of it. So may it be.